The world was quiet before they came. The monks of Lindisfarne woke to gulls crying over the grey sea, to bells echoing across a cold shore. They had known peace for generations, a small brotherhood at the edge of God's creation. To them, the horizon was not a place from which men came, but a border between this world and the next. But one morning in the summer of 793, that horizon moved. At first, it seemed like mist, a low, pale band rolling toward the island. Then came the glint of light on metal, the rhythmic rise of shapes cutting through the water. Longboats, sleek, narrow, alive with motion, their carved prows like beasts from some pagan dream. The monks began to ring the bells, thinking perhaps a storm was coming. They were right, but not of wind or rain. The longboat slid onto the sand with a hiss, and men leapt ashore. Tall men, clad in wool and leather, their hair braided, their axes glinting like shards of the dawn. They moved with purpose, not rage like craftsmen performing a well-practiced trade. When they reached the monastery gates, they did not ask for entry. What happened next would echo through all Christendom. By sunset, Lindisfarne was ash and ruin. The altar was overturned, the relics scattered. The bodies of holy men lay on the stones where they had once prayed. The raiders took gold, silver, and slaves, but what they truly left behind was terror. For centuries afterward, chroniclers wrote that demons had risen from the sea. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded it in one cold sentence. In this year, fierce, foreboding omens came over the land of Northumbria, and the heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne. To the Christian world, this was unthinkable. To the men of the north, it was destiny. In the fjords of Norway and the long bays of Denmark, life was carved from ice and stone. The land was rich in beauty but poor in mercy. There were no kings, only jarls and clans, each bound by blood and oath. A man's worth was his courage, his fame, his only immortality. They called themselves Norsemen, the people of the north. Their gods were not merciful. Odin, the one-eyed wanderer, demanded wisdom bought with suffering. Thor, the thunderer, protected men through strength alone. And far below them, in the roots of the world tree, the serpent waited reminder that all things, even gods, must one day fall. To these people, death was not an end but a bargain. To die with a weapon in hand was to enter Valhalla, to feast until the final battle at the end of time. It was a hard creed, but it bred a kind of fearlessness unknown to softer lands. The men who struck Lindisfarne were not soldiers of an empire. They were farmers, fishermen, and wanderers, driven by hunger, pride, and the restless need to test their fate. In their longboats, they carried not only swords and axes, but the beginnings of a new age, an age of motion. They learned that monasteries held gold, and that the men who guarded them believed peace to be eternal. Soon, word spread across the fjords. Within years, ships from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark sailed not only for England's coasts, but for the wide rivers of Francia and the green islands of the west. Each raid was a message to Europe. The north had awakened. At first, no one knew who these strangers were. They seemed to appear and vanish with the tides. Monks wrote of sea wolves, creatures not wholly human, sent by God as punishment for the sins of man. In truth, they were explorers of the highest order, navigators who read the stars like scripture. Their longships were miracles of design, light enough to be carried over land, strong enough to cross the open sea. With a single sail and 50 oars, they could move faster than any fleet in Europe. Wherever there was water, they could go, and wherever they went, kingdoms trembled. In 795, they struck again Iona. Another holy island fell in fire. Then the Hebrides, the Orkneys, Ireland's coast. By 799, the Carolingian Empire itself was warned of their coming. Charlemagne, the most powerful man in Europe, wrote letters filled with both awe and dread, ordering prayers in every church for deliverance from the Northmen's fury. Still, they came. They came for gold, but also for glory. For in the Norse world, fame was the only thing that defied death. The sagas said, "Cattle die, kin die, all men die, but glory never dies for the man who wins it." Every raid, every victory, every death carved their names into memory. But even as they burned, they also learned. The same monks they enslaved became their teachers. From the ruins of monasteries, Norsemen carried home not only treasure but tales of foreign gods, strange laws, and the power of written words. It was the beginning of something Europe had not seen since Rome, a people both savage and adaptable, shaped by war yet hungry for more than conquest. The Vikings were not content to destroy the world they found. They would remake it in their image. By the turn of the 9th century, the raiders began to change. The first generation had been driven by need and chance. The next would be driven by ambition. They no longer sought mere plunder, they wanted land, rule, and legacy. From their homelands in Scandinavia, they looked out upon the soft, fractured kingdoms of the South England divided, Francia at war with itself, Ireland splintered among petty kings. To men of the North, this was opportunity written in blood and wind. The raids became campaigns. The sea became a road. And what had begun as terror would soon become empire. The old chroniclers called it God's punishment, but history would call it something else. The beginning of the Viking Age. The smoke of Lindisfarne did not fade with the tide. It carried across the North Sea in rumor, in fear, in prayer. And as it spread, so did the ships that had caused it. By the time the next summer came, sails were appearing all along the coast of the British Isles. First Northumbria, then Ireland, then the Hebrides. Each raid was small, swift, precise, like the strike of a falcon, yet their pattern was unmistakable. The Northmen had learned that the Christian world was rich and undefended. They came at dawn, when fog still hugged the water. They struck monasteries, ports, and manors. And by the time the sun rose high enough to glint off their blades, they were already gone, leaving behind silence, smoke, and the memory of terror. The English called them Hyen men, heathen men. To the Franks, they were Normanni men of the north. To themselves, they were simply Vikings, wanderers, seekers, men between worlds. The word Viking was not a name of a people, but of an act. To go a Viking was to take to the sea, to seek fortune and fame beyond the horizon. It was not always war. It could mean trade, exploration, or exile. For in Scandinavia, where land was scarce and families large, many younger sons had no inheritance but courage. So they built ships. The longship was the secret of their age, a vessel so advanced that Europe would not see its like again for 1,000 years. Its hull was long and narrow, built from overlapping planks that flexed with the waves. It could sail in deep seas and glide up shallow rivers alike. A single ship could carry 100 men, 30 tons of cargo, or both. It was part weapon, part miracle, the beating heart of a civilization that worshipped the sea. In Norway, where the mountains fell straight into the fjords, men learned to carve beauty into strength. In Denmark, where the coasts were flat and the wind constant, kings began to rise. In Sweden, the rivers ran east not toward the Christian world, but toward the forests and trade routes of the Slavs. There, Norse merchants founded towns like Birka and laid the foundations of what would become the Rus. The world was widening, and for the first time since Rome's fall, Europe's edges began to reconnect not through emperors or popes, but through men of oak and iron who followed no banner but their own. By 800, their reach was astonishing. The same year that Charlemagne was crowned emperor in Rome, his empire's coasts burned. Vikings raided the Frisian Islands, then the Rhine Delta. They attacked the western coast of France, slipping into rivers and striking deep into the countryside. No fortress was too strong, no church too sacred. Yet the Vikings were not mindless destroyers. They were opportunists, precise and pragmatic. If a lord offered tribute, they spared his lands. If a monastery surrendered its gold, They left its monks alive. They learned to ransom nobles, to extort towns, to play kingdoms against one another. It was a form of warfare Europe had forgotten fast, mobile, without pity or politics, and against it, the old feudal armies were helpless. But the Vikings did not only take, they traded. In the same markets where they sold stolen silver, they bartered furs, amber, walrus ivory, and slaves, the living currency of the age. They sailed from the Shetlands to Spain, from Ireland to Byzantium. They founded ports on Ireland's coasts that would become cities Dublin, Waterford, Limerick. What began as plunder evolved into connection. In their wake, languages blended, place names changed, coins bearing Arabic script found their way to Scandinavian graves. The Viking world was becoming not just a terror, but a network, a new web of commerce that linked the Atlantic to the east. The Christian world struggled to understand what it faced. To kings and priests, the Vikings seemed like chaos incarnate, unbound by law, faith, or mercy. But in truth, they had their own order, as rigid as any monk's rule. A Viking owed loyalty to his kin, honor to his name, and vengeance for every wrong. To show mercy was weakness. To show courage was divine. A man who died without glory died twice, once in the flesh and once in memory. So they built songs as they built ships to last beyond the grave. In the sagas that would one day be written, even the smallest raid became myth, and every death a doorway to eternity. The southern kingdoms tried to resist. In 810, Charlemagne himself sent fleets to defend his coasts. For a time, the raids slowed, but they never stopped. When Charlemagne died, his empire splintered among his sons. The Vikings watched, waited, and struck again. Now, they no longer came as bands of a dozen ships, but hundreds. Entire fjords emptied of men. The North Sea became a highway of ambition. In 820, they attacked Ireland again, burning Armagh and seizing captives by the hundreds. In Francia, they pushed up the Seine, looting towns within sight of Paris. It was no longer a series of raids. It was a season, a rhythm of violence that Europe would come to know by heart. And yet, within this storm, the seeds of something new were already taking root. Among the warriors were men who chose not to return home. They saw in the green fields of Ireland, in the gentle coasts of England, something their homeland could not offer: fertile land, warmer skies, the chance to build rather than burn. They settled. The first Norse farms appeared on the western isles of Scotland, the Orkneys and the Hebrides. Norse chieftains built halls and took local wives. Over time, these settlers began to blend with the people they had once enslaved, forging new cultures, new languages, and new loyalties. What began as destruction was slowly becoming creation. By 820, the Viking Age was no longer a story of raiders and victims. It was a collision of gods and kings, of sea and soil, of two worlds learning, through blood and fire, how to coexist. Europe had awakened to the sound of the oar and the song of the north wind. And far away, across the icy fjords, young men gathered under new banners, men who would not be content with gold alone. They would come not merely to plunder, but to rule. The age of the raids was ending. The age of the Viking kings was about to begin. The seas that once echoed with raiders' cries had grown familiar with their rhythm. By the 9th century, the coastlines of Britain, Ireland, and Francia no longer feared the occasional sail on the horizon. They expected it. But what had begun as plunder was changing. The men who once came to steal now came to stay. In Denmark and Norway, rival jarls chieftains bound by ambition and vengeance began to see beyond the fjord. The wealth of the West was not endless, but the land was. Why return home each winter when the soil of England could yield grain and its rivers could bear trade? The first Viking settlements became permanent bases: Dublin, York, Rouen. Each spring, fleets returned not from the north, but from these new homes. Europe's map was shifting beneath its own memory. Amid this transformation, rose a name Ragnar Lothbrok. Whether man, myth, or both, Ragnar's legend embodied everything the North believed about fate and fire. The sagas would later call him the scourge of kings, a farmer's son who became the terror of empires. But behind the myth lies a truth. Sometime in the mid-9th century, a warlord of immense charisma united the scattered fleets of Scandinavia into a single force. He came not for gold, but for glory. Ragnar's world was one of shifting alliances. His followers swore oaths over blood and iron. Loyalty was bought in silver and sealed in battle. Those who defied him were cut down, not for cruelty, but for order, the kind of order that only chaos could respect. He gathered warriors from Denmark, Norway, and even Sweden, men whose names would echo through centuries. Bjorn Ironside, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, Sigurd Snake in the Eye. Some may have been his sons, others his myths. Together, they built something the world had never seen: a Viking confederation, united not by crown or creed, but by the promise of immortality through conquest. The English kingdoms of the time were fragile. Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, names of pride. Yet each ruled by men more accustomed to quill than sword. Their armies were small, their walls thin. Their gods, foreign and merciful, were no match for the storm of the north. The first major strike came not as a raid, but as an invasion. Around 845, a fleet believed to be Ragnar's sailed up the Seine. Paris, a city of scholars and relics, awoke to find its river choked with dragon-headed ships. The Franks panicked. They prayed, then paid. King Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, met the Vikings not in battle but in negotiation. He offered 7,000 pounds of silver, enough to fill the holds of a dozen ships to leave Paris untouched. Ragnar took it, laughed, and sailed away. It was the birth of a new kind of war, not fought by steel, but by fear. Ragnar's raids reached far beyond France. The Irish monasteries he struck in the 842s became stepping stones to greater prizes. From there, he struck into Scotland, then south toward Northumbria. Each victory carried the same message: the age of isolation was over. In 845, the same year he ransomed Paris, another legend took shape that Ragnar met his end in England, captured by King Ella of Northumbria and thrown into a pit of serpents. The story is beautiful in its cruelty. The sagas say he laughed as the snakes bit into him. His last words a prophecy, that his sons would avenge him with fire and fury, that the heathen army would come for Ella's blood. History offers no proof, but what followed in the decades after feels like destiny fulfilling itself. The fall of Ragnar, real or imagined, became the spark that lit a continent. In 865, the great heathen army landed on the shores of East Anglia, hundreds of ships, thousands of warriors, bearing the banners of Ivar, Halfdan, and Ube, the supposed sons of Ragnar. They did not come to raid. They came to conquer. For the first time, the Viking goal was not silver, but sovereignty. The army moved inland, capturing towns, executing kings, and wintering in England's heartlands. York fell. Northumbria crumbled. The old Anglo-Saxon order began to fracture under their boots. No longer did the English fight shadows in the fog. They faced an army that could build, besiege, and govern. But before that storm, there was a decade of quiet fire, the years between 820 and 860, when Scandinavia itself began to transform. In Denmark, power coalesced under a line of kings, men like Horik, who ruled from Hedeby, a city of merchants and mercenaries where ships from every sea met. In Norway, jarls feuded and traded along the coast, each trying to carve dominion from mountain and wave. In Sweden, traders followed the rivers east into the heart of the Slavic lands, reaching the Black Sea and Byzantium. They brought back silk, silver, and stories of empires richer than their wildest dreams. These were not the wild barbarians Europe imagined. They were becoming builders, explorers, kings. By mid-century, Viking colonies dotted the map like constellations. In Ireland, Dublin had grown from a camp to a kingdom, ruled by Norse Gaelic warlords who taxed trade and minted coins. In northern France, the Seine Valley was a Viking highway. And on the island of Britain, the old order was breaking. Each monastery rebuilt after a raid soon found itself paying tribute again. The church called it Danegeld, money for peace, but it bought only time. For every silver coin sent north, another ship was built, another son armed, another god appeased. The Norse pantheon thrived on war. Odin demanded the fallen. Thor's hammer blessed the strong. And for every man who fell in battle, another rose believing that death was merely a gate to Valhalla. In such a faith, conquest was not sin, it was salvation. The age of raids was ending, but the age of conquest had begun. Kings were rising from chaos. Armies were replacing fleets, and across the north, a new hunger was stirring, not for plunder, but for permanence. They had tasted the world. Now they wanted to own it. And in that hunger lay both their triumph and their doom. When winter fell upon the North Sea in the year 865, it did not bring silence. It brought sails. From Denmark came the largest Viking force the world had ever seen, a fleet so vast that chroniclers called it Myselhere, the great heathen army. Hundreds of ships crossed the icy waters, black against the gray horizon, their prows carved with serpents and dragons. They were not raiders now. They were a nation in motion. Their purpose was vengeance, or so the sagas claimed. The sons of Ragnar Lothbrok had sworn to avenge their father's death at the hands of Ella, king of Northumbria. But vengeance was only the beginning. When the fleet landed in East Anglia, the local king, Edmund, offered them horses and tribute, hoping to buy peace. The Vikings accepted not out of mercy, but strategy. They did not come for one kingdom, they came for all of them. By winter's end, the great army rode north, crossing frozen rivers and burned fields. They struck Northumbria first, the cradle of England's old faith, where monasteries had once sung to God. At York, they faced Ella, the man the sagas blamed for Ragnar's death. The chronicles tell that Ella fell in battle. The legends whisper that he was taken alive, executed by the blood eagle, a ritual of horror and honor, half myth, half warning. However he died, his kingdom died with him. York became a Norse stronghold, its churches stripped, its walls rebuilt in the image of the North. The dragon banners of the sons of Ragnar flew over England's oldest holy ground. The year 867 saw the great army settle into rhythm. While their fathers had raided and vanished, these men stayed. They wintered in England, fortifying towns and dividing spoils like kings. They minted coins bearing Norse names and English crosses, symbols of a new hybrid power. Ivar the Boneless, the mind of the army, ruled with ruthless logic. He was no berserker, his weapon was patience. Some said he was crippled, others that his weakness made his mind sharper than any blade. He brokered alliances, bent rival lords to his will, and sowed fear with precision. Halfdan, his brother, brought order to the chaos, leading raids deeper into Mercia. Ube and Guthrum followed, carving paths through the Midlands and East Anglia. What began as vengeance had become invasion, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. The English kings tried to unite, but unity was a dream. Mercia negotiated, buying time with tribute. East Anglia prayed, then fought. King Edmund, once the ally of the Vikings, refused to betray his faith. Captured by the army, he was tied to a tree, shot with arrows, and beheaded, his body later enshrined by his people as Saint Edmund the Martyr. His death marked the turning point. The war was no longer between nations, but between worlds, the cross and the hammer, the old gods and the new. The great army spread like frost. They struck south toward the heart of England, crossing the Thames and seizing towns one by one. The monks chronicled their coming with trembling quills, and in this year the heathens wintered at Reading, and the land was full of their ships, and all the people fled before them. To the Vikings, these chronicles were trophies, proof that their names would live forever, written by the hands of those they conquered. Yet not all of England fell easily. In Wessex, a young prince named Alfred watched and waited. He studied the enemy's patterns, how they moved with the seasons, how their strength depended on supplies and ships. He knew that to defeat them would require not glory, but endurance. But that battle, the War of Alfred and Guthrum, the clash of kings and faith, belonged to the next generation. For now, the great army reigned unchallenged. Across the sea, word of their victories reached home. In Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, the tales grew like wildfire. Sons who had never seen England dreamed of crossing the whale road to claim its riches. Farms emptied. Villages turned silent as their youth sailed west. The Norse world was changing. The raids had become migrations. Families began to follow the warriors, wives, children, slaves, and craftsmen. The Viking presence was no longer a storm. It was a tide. With every conquest, the old gods seemed to grow stronger. Odin, the god of wisdom and war, was said to favor Ivar, the strategist whose victories defied reason. Thor, hammer in hand, guarded Halfdan and the berserkers who tore through Saxon lines. But beneath their triumphs, change was brewing. Some of the Norsemen began to wear crosses alongside their runes. They baptized their sons not from faith, but from convenience, a gesture, to ease alliances or claim legitimacy over Christian lands. In England's north, a new culture was being born, Norse in blood, English in tongue. The sagas would call it the Danelaw, the region where Viking law ruled, and the border between worlds ran down the rivers like a scar. By 870, the great heathen army stood at its zenith. 4 kingdoms had fallen or paid tribute. Their silver weighed down ships, and their banners marked the hills. But their unity began to fracture. Ivar vanished from the chronicles, whether dead, retired, or ruling elsewhere. No one knew. Without him, ambition replaced order. Halfdan turned his eyes to Northumbria, seeking to plant his own line of kings. Guthrum looked south, toward Wessex, where the last resistance stirred. The great army, once a single force, was splintering, each commander chasing his own fate. The age of Ragnar's sons was ending, but their legacy had already reshaped the map of Europe. For the first time, the Vikings were not the shadow that haunted Christendom. They were part of it, settlers, rulers, kings. In the ashes of war, they found the beginnings of belonging. Yet with every town they claimed, with every cross they raised, something of their old world began to fade. The gods of the north still whispered, but fainter now, as if the wind carried their voices farther away. The sons of Ragnar had avenged their father, conquered his enemies, and carved their names into history. But the sea was never still, and neither was fate. Soon, new leaders would rise from these ashes, and in their hands the Viking world would turn from iron to empire. By the year 871, England was a shattered mosaic. 4 crowns had fallen or bent beneath the Norse hammer, and the cross itself trembled under the weight of foreign gods. To the north, the Danelaw stretched across river valleys and coasts, a patchwork of warlords and jarls, each ruling from the ruins of English towns. York, once Eoforwick, had become Jorvik, the jewel of Viking Northumbria, a city of smoke and silver, where English monks traded relics for safety, and Norse merchants weighed amber beside crucifixes. The air carried 2 tongues, the old Saxon prayers and the guttural Norse of the Sea Kings. And over it all hung the scent of iron, blood, forge, and coin. This was not invasion anymore. It was transformation. The age of raids had ended. The age of rule had begun. Halfdan, the son of Ragnar, declared himself king of Northumbria. From his hall in York, he sent out coins stamped with his name in Latin letters, proof that the conqueror sought not only dominion, but legitimacy. He divided the land among his men, carving estates where monasteries once stood. Fields that had been plowed by monks were now worked by Norse settlers, their plows guided by men who once swung axes in battle. These were no longer marauders. They were farmers, traders, fathers, yet still warriors at heart. Across the Irish Sea, their kinsmen had done the same. In Dublin, Norse jarls ruled from longhouses built on old Gaelic ground, their ships controlling the western sea routes from Norway to the Isles of Man. In both islands, the Vikings had ceased to be outsiders. They had become lords. But south of the Thames, one kingdom still stood. Wessex, the land of the West Saxons, had resisted where others fell. Its people were weary, its fields burned, its monasteries looted, yet its heart still beat. And at its center rose a man not yet 30, a prince-turned-warrior called Alfred. He had grown up in the shadow of chaos. He had seen his brothers fall one by one to the invaders. He had fled, fought, bargained, and prayed. But he never yielded. In 871, the same year that the great heathen army reached its height, Alfred's brother, King Ethelred, died in battle. The crown passed to Alfred not as a gift, but as a burden. He inherited not a kingdom, but a war. That winter, the Viking warlord Guthrum marched south with a vast host, striking into Wessex with fire and fury. For months, the land burned, towns vanished. Monasteries that had survived one generation of Vikings were destroyed by the next. By 878, Wessex seemed doomed. Alfred was forced into hiding not in a castle, but in the swamps of Somerset, where he gathered what few loyal men he could find. The chronicles say he lived among peasants, disguised, poor and hungry. The legend says he once burned a woman's cakes while lost in thought about his kingdom. Yet in that exile, a king was remade. For in the silence of those marshes, Alfred learned the patience of the earth itself, how to wait, to endure, and then to strike. Spring came with vengeance. From the mists of the Somerset marshes, Alfred gathered his scattered thangs and fyrds, farmers with spears, monks with axes, men who had lost everything but hope. They met the Viking army at Edington, on a hill washed with blood. The battle lasted a single day. When it ended, Guthrum's men broke and fled, and the Norse leader himself was trapped, forced to surrender. In a decision that stunned both friend and foe, Alfred did not execute him. Instead, he baptized him. Guthrum took a Christian name, Athelstan, and swore peace. It was not mercy. It was strategy. Alfred understood what the sword could not keep, the word might bind. The Treaty of Wedmore that followed divided England in two. To the north and east lay the Danelaw, the lands of Viking rule, from York to East Anglia. To the south and west lay Alfred's Wessex, a fragile remnant of Old England, girded by new resolve. The frontier between them was not just a border of land, but of faith, law, and language. In the Danelaw, Norse words crept into English speech: sky, window, law, husband. In Wessex, English monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, preserving the memory of a world that seemed to be slipping away. Yet both sides shared something now, a strange respect. The Vikings had brought ruin, but also renewal. They forced the English to adapt, to unify, to think as a nation, not a cluster of lords. The conquerors had become catalysts. By the 882nd, Alfred's power grew. He rebuilt ruined towns, burhs, fortified settlements connected by roads and watchtowers. He trained new armies, built ships to match the Viking longboats, and filled his halls with scholars. He gathered laws, translated holy texts into English, and forged a kingdom rooted not in lineage, but in learning. To the monks who wrote his story, he was Rex Doctissimus, the learned king. To his enemies, he was Alfred, the wise counselor. The Viking threat had not ended, but it had met its match. North of his borders, the Norse jarls continued to carve their realms. In York, Guthrum's successors minted coins that bore both the hammer of Thor and the cross of Christ, symbols of a world still undecided. In the Danelaw towns, Viking craftsmen built markets that traded with the Baltic and the Mediterranean, bringing wealth England had never known. In Ireland, Norse Gaelic dynasties intermarried with local kings, blending cultures into something new and fierce. Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick became Viking ports, bridges between two civilizations. The Northmen, who had once been exiles, were now architects of empire. But even in peace, they carried the old hunger, the restlessness of the sea. New fleets sailed west, seeking unknown lands beyond the Atlantic fog. Others went east, through the rivers of Russia, to the markets of Byzantium. The Viking Age had begun as plunder, grown into conquest, and was now turning into exploration. Yet beneath this expansion lay the shadow of time, for every age of iron turns to rust. The war was not over, but the silence that followed it was new. In the years after Eddington, England seemed to breathe again. Smoke no longer rose from every horizon, and the bells of the churches, what few still stood, began to toll not for death, but for mass. For the first time in a generation, children grew up without seeing the sails of death on the horizon. But peace, Alfred knew, was a fragile thing. It had to be built, brick by brick, mind by mind. And so the young king set out not to rest, but to rebuild the soul of his kingdom. The world he inherited was half ruin, half memory. Towns once filled with laughter and trade were now broken shells, haunted by ghosts and beggars. The English countryside was littered with abandoned plows, half-burned crosses, and scattered bones. Alfred began by fortifying what remained. He built a chain of burhs, walled towns across Wessex, linked by roads, garrisons, and watchfires. Each was placed within a day's march of another, so no village would stand alone again. These were not just forts, they were lifelines. Merchants came to trade under their protection. Farmers brought grain. Artisans, once displaced by war, returned to craft and teach. Within a decade, the burhs became more than walls, they became cities. The next war Alfred fought was not against men, but against ignorance. He saw that the chaos of the past had not only burned England's fields, but also its books. Monasteries that once copied sacred texts were now rubble. Priests could barely read Latin. So he declared that knowledge itself was a weapon, and that no kingdom could stand without it. He gathered scholars from across Britain and the continent, from Mercia, from Francia, from the north where the old monasteries still held fragments of learning. Together, they translated sacred and philosophical works into the tongue of the people, Old English. For the first time, the wisdom of Rome and the Gospels of Christ were written in the words of farmers and soldiers. He even took up the pen himself, translating Boethius, Gregory, and Augustine. The warrior king became the philosopher king, a ruler who rebuilt his realm not through conquest, but through literacy. Meanwhile, the Danelaw, that vast territory stretching across the heart of England, was changing too. The Norse settlers who had come to raid now plowed the same earth they once burned. Their longhouses rose beside Saxon cottages. Their children learned to speak both tongues. The Danes brought their customs, the Thing, their assembly of free men, where disputes were settled by voice and oath. The English brought their law, written, recorded, and sealed by kingly hand. In time, the two traditions merged. From them, England gained something entirely new, a balance between royal decree and communal judgment, a foundation of governance that would outlive both Alfred and the Vikings themselves. The land once split by sword was now stitched together by law. And yet, the frontier still pulsed with unease. Along the border rivers, the Leah, the Trent, the Humber raiders still tested the peace. Bands of Norse warriors, untamed and restless, refused to kneel to Guthrum's treaty or Alfred's diplomacy. They came from the sea like ghosts of an older age, striking coastal villages, vanishing before the ferd could gather. Alfred responded not with panic, but with innovation. He built the first English Navy fleets of ships larger and swifter than the Viking longboats, designed to fight them on their own waters. He stationed them at river mouths, where they could intercept the sea wolves before they reached the land. It was not always victory, but it was evolution. And that, more than any single battle, was Alfred's genius. He learned from his enemies, and used their own strength against them. The Vikings had conquered by sea. Alfred would defend by sea. By the 892nd, the balance had shifted. The great wave of invasion had broken. The Danes in the Danelaw farmed and traded more than they raided. England was no longer a victim, it was becoming a state. The chroniclers of the age, writing in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that Alfred himself commissioned, began to call him not just Rex Wessex, but Rex Anglorum, King of the English. It was the first time such a title had been written. And though the realm was still divided, the idea had taken root that there could be one England, forged from both Saxon and Dane. Beyond the seas, word of Alfred's rebirth reached distant lands. To the Franks, he was a Christian hero. To the Norwegians, a worthy rival. Even in Rome, the Pope sent him gifts, books, relics, and a blessing. The man who had once hidden in the swamps of Somerset now ruled a kingdom admired across Christendom. But Alfred's own view of his reign was humble. He saw himself not as the founder of a golden age, but as a caretaker tending a flame that must not go out. He wrote, "It seems to me that we have need of many things that are lacking in this land, both men of prayer and men of war, and men who can still learn wisdom." To him, peace was not a reward. It was a duty. Meanwhile, in the north, a quiet transformation took hold. The children of Norsemen and English women, baptized, bilingual, and bound to both heritages, began to call themselves something new: Anglo-Danes. They built towns where two worlds met: York, Lincoln, Nottingham, places of trade, learning, and hybrid culture. Their coinage bore Latin letters, but their art still carved dragons and serpents. They told sagas that mixed Odin with the Christian god. They drank toasts to Thor and then crossed themselves before bed. The old world and the new had not reconciled, they had fused. When Alfred died in 899, England mourned not a conqueror, but a creator. He was laid to rest in Winchester, surrounded by the monks and warriors who had built his dream with him. Outside the abbey, the people gathered: farmers, priests, soldiers, scholars, men and women who had lived through an age of terror and emerged into an age of order. They did not see a saint or a god. They saw something rarer: a king who had been both their shield and their teacher. In his lifetime, Alfred had fought a dozen wars, built cities, founded schools, and written laws. But his greatest victory was not on the battlefield. It was the simple, defiant act of surviving and teaching his people how to live again. When the chroniclers closed their ink-stained books, they wrote of the age that had passed. Then there was peace in the land, as long as the king lived. And in that single line lay both prophecy and warning. For peace, like all things in the Middle Ages, was mortal. Beyond the northern rivers, new warlords were already rising. New fleets were being built. The iron kingdoms Alfred forged would soon be tested by fire once more. The sons of war became the builders of kingdoms. When King Alfred's body was laid in the earth at Winchester, the people of Wessex believed an age had ended, but in truth, the age he had shaped was only beginning. His dream of one England, born in fire and faith, now passed to his son Edward, called the Elder. Edward inherited not a crown of gold, but of iron. His borders were ringed by enemies, his allies unsteady, his throne uncertain. The Danelaw to the north remained vast and proud, ruled by Norse jarls who owed him no loyalty. In Mercia, his own sister, the indomitable Ethelflad, Lady of the Mercians, commanded armies and towns in her own right. And beyond the Humber, the Norse cities, York, Lincoln, and Nottingham, thrived like independent kingdoms, half Viking, half English, all ambitious. Yet the son of Alfred did not rule with mere inheritance. He ruled with purpose. Edward had grown up in the shadow of his father's wars. As a boy, he'd seen villages burn and cities fall. As a man, he understood what Alfred's peace required, strength enough to defend it. And so, even as he fortified the burhs, Edward began to forge something greater, not just a kingdom of walls, but a kingdom of unity. In the first years of his reign, the old Viking threat seemed to slumber. Across the Danelaw, jarls governed their territories with uneasy calm. Guthrum, Alfred's former enemy, had died, baptized, and buried as a Christian. His sons and kinsmen ruled East Anglia and Northumbria with hybrid customs, speaking Norse in their halls, English in their markets, and Latin in their churches. It was a strange peace, one built on exhaustion as much as compromise. But peace, in the Viking world, was only a pause between voyages. By 910, war came again, not from the sea this time, but from the north. A coalition of Norse and Northumbrian warlords marched into Mercia, seeking to reclaim what Alfred had taken. They met the combined armies of Edward and his sister Ethelflad on the banks of the River Tame. The battle that followed Tettenhall would become one of the turning points of the age. The Viking host was vast, its banners marked with wolves, ravens, and serpents. They fought with the fury of men who believed Odin watched. But Edward's army fought for home, for England. By sunset, the field was red. The Norse leaders Eowulf, Halfdan, and Ingvar lay among the dead. It was not just a victory. It was the death of the old invasion dream. The Viking kings who had once ruled with fire now found their thrones trembling beneath them. In the years that followed, the strange alliance between brother and sister Edward in Wessex, Ethelflad in Mercia, began to encircle the Danelaw. Town by town, river by river, they built new burghs: Oxford, Stafford, Warwick, Chester. Each fort was both shield and spear, a place of defense and a foothold of reconquest. As Edward pressed from the south, Ethelflad's banners rose from the west. Together, they reclaimed the Midlands, cutting the Danelaw in two. By the 922nd, their campaign was relentless. Danish lords swore oaths to Edward or fled north to York. Mercia, once a rival to Wessex, now fought beside it as equal. The Lady of the Mercians ruled her territory with the authority of a king. Contemporaries called her Merkna Halefdig, the Lady of the Mercians. But to the chroniclers, she was a second Alfred. She fortified towns, led armies, and personally oversaw the siege of Derby and Leicester. The chronicles record her triumph with quiet reverence, and the Lady Ethelflad, by God's grace, won Derby, and there were slain 4 of her things. She was both ruler and warrior, the last great woman of the Anglo-Saxon world before queens became consorts again. When Ethelflad died in 918, her death was mourned across both English and Danish lands. The Mercians, fearing domination by Wessex, sought to crown her daughter. But Edward marched swiftly to claim the heartland his sister had restored. Mercia was absorbed into Wessex not by conquest, but by inheritance. For the first time, nearly all the English south of the Humber bowed to one king. The dream of Alfred, one kingdom under one law, was closer than ever. North of that border, however, the Norse city of York still defied the southern crown. There, Viking kings ruled by axe and silver, their armies reinforced by ships from Dublin and Norway. York had become a capital of the Norse diaspora, a place where traders and raiders, poets and killers mingled under the dragon banner. Its markets were filled with silk and amber. Its temples whispered with both Christian hymns and pagan charms. It was a city of twilight faiths, a bridge between the world of Odin and that of Christ. From there, the Viking kings of Northumbria watched Edward's expansion with growing unease. They called him the Saxon Wolf. But the wolf was not yet done hunting. In 920, Edward marched north with an army unlike any England had seen: Saxons, Mercians, Welsh, and even converted Danes under one banner. The chronicles say that the kings of Northumbria, of Strathclyde, and even of the Scots came to him at Bakewell not as equals, but as subjects. For a fleeting moment, England stood whole not by conquest, but by recognition. It was the dawn of something new. When Edward died in 924, he was buried beside Alfred, in Winchester, the city his father had built and his sister had saved. His legacy was simple, yet monumental. He had turned Alfred's fragile peace into a lasting kingdom. But destiny, as always, had another heir waiting. Edward's son, Aethelstan, would inherit not a divided land, but a united vision, and in his reign, that vision would finally become a nation. When Edward the Elder's body was laid beside Alfred's in Winchester, his son Ethelstan inherited not only a crown but a dream his forefathers had carved in blood. He was young, sharp-minded, and already seasoned by command, raised under the iron tutelage of his aunt Ethelfled in Mercia. He had learned more than war from her. He had learned the art of ruling diverse peoples, of speaking to Saxons, Mercians, Danes, and Britons as one. And in the forge of that divided island, Ethelstan was about to craft something England had never seen before: a single, united kingdom. When his father died in 924, not everyone welcomed him. Wessex nobles doubted him, seeing him as half Mercian, half outsider. The northern lords, still half pagan and fiercely independent, watched for weakness. The Viking kings in York whispered that the south was fracturing, but Ethelstan's first act as king silenced doubt. He moved swiftly to consolidate power, gathering his nobles and clergy, demanding loyalty in the name of God and of Alfred's legacy. He saw what his grandfather had begun, what his father had nearly finished, and he swore he would make it whole. Within a year, he marched north. The Viking lords of York resisted, but their strength had waned. Trade and mixed marriages had softened their edge. Christian priests were as common in York as Norse skalds. Ethelstan entered the city not as a conqueror but as a king. He offered pardon to those who swore fealty, silver to those who bent the knee, and the sword to those who would not. For the first time, the banners of Wessex flew over all England south of the Humber. And when the northern jarls knelt, even the Scots king, Constantine II, and the princes of Strathclyde sent tribute. It was said that at that moment, England itself was born. Ethelstan styled himself Rex Totius Britanniae, King of all Britain. To his enemies, it was arrogance. To his people, prophecy fulfilled. He was no mere warlord. Like his grandfather, Ethelstan was a scholar and visionary. His court became a beacon of law, faith, and art, a meeting place of monks, poets, and envoys from across Christendom. He established royal schools, reformed justice, minted uniform coinage, and strengthened the church. For a brief golden moment, Wessex seemed not the weary survivor of invasions, but the heart of a new Christian empire in the north. But peace never lasts long in the land of wolves. Beyond the seas, the sons of those who had once raided Lindisfarne watched Æthelstan's growing power with envy. Viking kings in Dublin, led by the ambitious Olaf Guthrithson, grandson of the first Norse kings of York, dreamed of reclaiming their ancestral stronghold. In Scotland, King Constantine resented the young English monarch's claims of overlordship. Old rivalries stirred, and alliances began to form in the shadows. By 937, the storm Ethelstan had long feared broke upon him. A coalition of Norse, Scots, and Strathclyde Britons, an army drawn from every shore that had once felt the thunder of Viking oars, united to crush him. Olaf of Dublin landed in Northumbria with a host of Danes and Irish warriors, their ships blackening the coast. Constantine led the Scots south, while the Britons of Strathclyde swept down from the west. It was the greatest invasion since Alfred's time, a northern crusade to erase England before it had fully begun. Ethelstan gathered his army West Saxons, Mercians, Welsh auxiliaries, and converted Danes loyal to his rule. He was not merely defending land, he was defending the very idea of England. The armies met at a place called Brunanburh. Its exact site is lost to time, perhaps in Yorkshire, perhaps near the Wirral coast, but its memory burned into every English heart thereafter. The morning broke cold and gray, mist curling over the marshland. Across the field, the northern coalition stretched in glittering lines of spears and banners, each bearing the marks of a different land. Ethelstan rode the lines silently, his mail shining with dew, his standard, the golden dragon of Wessex, snapping in the wind. He had no need for speeches. His men knew what was at stake. If they failed, the island would return to the age of fire and plunder. If they stood, a nation would live. When the horns sounded, the world narrowed to steel and blood. The clash was terrible, a storm of shields and axes, the air filled with the roar of men and the clang of iron. The Norse charged again and again, Olaf's champions cutting deep into the English ranks. But Ethelstan's household troops, Thengs and Huscarls, who had fought since Alfred's day, held fast. The chroniclers later wrote that the sun was darkened by the flight of ravens, and that the ground drank blood until it could drink no more. By sunset, the northern coalition was broken. 5 kings lay dead, among them Constantine's son and Olaf's kin. The Norse fled to their ships, the Scots retreated north, the Britons vanished into the hills. Ethelstan stood victorious. The chroniclers called it the greatest battle ever fought between English and foreigners. England, born in the fire of the Viking invasions, had at last proven its right to exist. In the years that followed, Ethelstan's fame spread beyond his island. Emperors and popes wrote to him as an equal. He arranged marriages with the royal houses of Europe. Gifts from Aachen, Paris, and Rome filled his treasury. Relics, books, and swords sent to the king who had united the North. Yet even in triumph, the shadow of the old world lingered. The Norse would return, and the dream of unity would be tested again. But for a generation, Ethelstan's England stood unbroken, a fragile peace held by faith, law, and the memory of Brunanburh. When he died in 939, the bard sang that he was the father of kings, the lord of all the island. He was buried not in Winchester, but at Malmesbury, among the monks he had loved and the books he had gathered. Over his grave, a single phrase was carved: King of the English and of all Britain. In that stone lay both truth and prophecy. For though the Norse would rise again under new kings, with new fury the tide had turned forever. The children of Alfred had built more than a kingdom. They had built a nation that could survive the storm. After Ethelstan's death in 939, the land he had forged began to tremble again beneath the weight of old divisions. His half-brother Edmund, scarcely 18, took the throne, a young king facing a kingdom that had barely learned how to stand. The Viking North sensed weakness as wolves scent blood. Olaf Guthfrithson, the defeated Norse ruler of Dublin, returned across the Irish Sea to reclaim York. Within months, the black sails of the Norsemen were once again crowding the Humber, and the burhs that Alfred had built stood ready for siege. Edmund, though untested, proved his lineage true. In 941, he led a campaign that matched his father's fire and his grandfather's will. Town by town, he drove the Norsemen north, and when Olaf fell in battle, his dream of reconquest died with him. Peace returned, briefly. Yet every peace in that age carried within it the memory of fire. When Edmund was slain a few years later, not in war, but by the dagger of a thief during a feast, England seemed to shudder with old fears. His brother Edred took the crown, ruling a land still haunted by Norse ghosts. To the north, the city of York, that eternal frontier, once again slipped into Viking hands. Eric Bloodaxe, the exiled king of Norway, fierce and half-mad, seized it and ruled with the savagery that had earned his name. He was the last true Viking king in England, and his reign burned bright and brief. In 954, the English armies moved north one final time. The chronicles record only that Eric fell, betrayed by his own, but the meaning was clear. The Norse kingdom of York was no more. At long last, the sons of Odin had been driven from England's soil. The Danelaw was over, and Edred's banner flew from the Channel to the Firth of Forth. The dream Alfred had kindled, one crown, one faith, one law, had finally become real. Yet even in triumph, the air was heavy with change. The age of the pagan sea kings was ending, but their spirit, fierce, restless, and ambitious, had not vanished. Across the North Sea, a new kind of Viking was rising. In Denmark, a chieftain named Harald Bluetooth was carving a kingdom from chaos. Son of the old warlord Gorm the Old, Harald ruled with both the sword and the cross. He was no longer merely a raider of foreign shores. He was a king, a builder of fortresses, a converter of peoples. Where his ancestors had raised longships, Harold raised ring forts, vast circular strongholds of stone and timber, their precision astonishing even modern eyes. They were not homes of nomads, but of a nation awakening. Around 960, Harold declared himself Christian not out of piety, but politics. The age of the hammer was yielding to the age of the cross, and he meant to wield both. He had his conversion carved into stone at Jelling, on the great rune that still bears his name. King Harold ordered this monument made in memory of Gorm, his father, and Thyra, his mother. Harold, who won all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. The words were boastful, but true enough. Harold Bluetooth had unified Denmark, absorbed southern Norway, and begun to turn the Vikings' fury inward from raiding to ruling. And as Denmark grew in power, the old rhythm of Viking life changed. The longships still sailed, but now they carried merchants as often as raiders. The Norse world, once fragmented into jarldoms and rival clans, was becoming a civilization in its own right, wealthy, literate, and restless. The saga writers of Iceland would later say that the gods themselves were fading. Odin's halls grew quiet, Thor's hammer rusted, and Christ the white god was taking their place. Yet beneath the new faith, the old instincts still stirred: ambition, pride, and the hunger for silver. Back in England, the young King Edgar, later called the Peaceful, ascended in 959. His reign was unlike that of any before him. No great wars scarred his years. No Viking fleets darkened his coasts. For the first time in memory, the land was whole and quiet. But Edgar understood the price of that quiet. He was no dreamer. He ruled as a man who had seen too much blood. He strengthened the burghs, enforced law with stern hand, and bound the church to his crown. His court at Winchester became the center of a reborn English culture, drawing monks and scholars from across Europe. The chronicles tell of his grand coronation at Bath in 973, when the kings of Wales and Scotland rowed his royal barge down the Avon as a symbol of homage. It was not merely ceremony. It was the assertion of empire, the heir of Alfred claiming not just England, but Britain. Under Edgar, the coinage stabilized, monasteries flourished, and the English navy, a fleet of sleek oared ships, patrolled the coasts. He was called the ruler of many kings, and even foreign chroniclers named him the greatest monarch north of the Alps. Yet while England bathed in peace, storms were gathering again beyond the sea. In Norway, the death of Harald Fairhair's descendants had plunged the land back into chaos. His sons and grandsons fought bitterly for the throne, driving some jarls into exile. Many fled to Iceland, carrying their sagas and songs. Others to Ireland and the Hebrides, bringing steel. Among them were new warlords who saw in England's peace not strength, but softness. The Danes, though Christian in name, had not forgotten the lure of English silver. The merchants who sailed between York, Ribe, and Hedeby whispered of the wealth of Edgar's realm of towns fat with trade and monasteries heavy with gold. And so, as Edgar's reign drew to an end, men began once again to look to the sea. In 975, when the peaceful king died, his death felt like the extinguishing of a lamp. He left 2 sons, Edward and Ethelred, children of rival queens. Their contest for succession tore open wounds that peace had only hidden. The elder, Edward, took the throne but reigned barely 3 years before being murdered at Corfe Castle, stabbed by his own attendants, perhaps at the urging of his stepmother. The chroniclers called him Edward the Martyr. His half-brother, Ethelred, was crowned amid the whispers of treachery, a boy king burdened by guilt not his own. His name would one day become a curse. For even as he grew to manhood, the sea began to darken again with sails. Across the North Sea, the heirs of Harold Bluetooth and Gorm the Old were uniting under a new power, Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, whose ambitions would reach farther than any Viking before him. He was coming not merely to raid, but to rule. And in his shadow, the age of peace was ending. When Ethelred took the throne in 978, the crown felt more like a chain. He was scarcely 12, a child placed upon a seat that still smelled of blood. The murder of his half-brother Edward haunted him, whispered about in taverns, preached of from pulpits, written by monks who called the act a sin crying to heaven. From the first moment, Ethelred's reign was stained with suspicion, and that stain would never fade. England had been a land of peace and order under Edgar. Now it drifted again toward confusion. The great earls, the old families of Mercia, Wessex, and Northumbria, grew proud and independent, their loyalty to the crown as thin as a coin's edge. The church whispered prayers for guidance. Merchants prayed for safety. Farmers prayed for calm seas. For across the North Sea, sails were beginning to bloom again like storm clouds. In Denmark, Sweyn Forkbeard had seized the throne from his father Harold Bluetooth after years of rebellion. Ruthless, brilliant, and utterly without sentiment, Sweyn was the very image of the old sea kings reborn. Yet he ruled a new kind of kingdom, a Christian realm with bishops and priests, fortified towns and minted coins. He wore the cross, but spoke the language of conquest. In his youth, Sweyn had watched the wealth of England drift across the sea, brought by merchants and missionaries, and he had listened to the sagas of the old days, the time when Viking longships carved gold from English shores. Now he meant to revive that legacy, not as a raider, but as a conqueror. Around 980, the first fleets began to arrive once more upon English coasts. At first, they were small raids on Devon and Cornwall, swift strikes that left smoke rising behind them, but soon the scale grew. In 991, 93 ships landed near Malden in Essex, commanded by the fearsome Olaf Tryggvason, another Norwegian exile seeking fortune and fame. The Battle of Malden became one of the defining tragedies of Ethelred's reign. The Ealdorman Berthnoth led the English defense, proud and honorable. But when the Vikings challenged him to fight on open ground, he agreed, calling it offermod, excess of courage. The English lines broke beneath the Norse assault, and the fields of Malden ran red. The poem written after the battle would echo for centuries. Will shall be the sterner, heart the bolder, spirit the greater, as our strength lessens. But courage was not enough to stop the storm. Ethelred, desperate and uncertain, sought peace by paying tribute. For the first time, the Danegeld was revived. 10,000 pounds of silver, bought in exchange for a promise of safety that would never last. Over the next 2 decades, the cycle of invasion and ransom repeated like the turning of a millstone. The Vikings came from Denmark, Norway, and Ireland, burning towns, enslaving villages, and vanishing before English armies could gather. Every time Ethelred paid them to go, they returned richer and bolder. By 1002, the Danegeld had risen to an astronomical 36,000 pounds, an impossible sum drawn from a people already weary of war. Silver flowed out of England like lifeblood, into the hands of the men who would soon come to kill again. In that same fateful year, Ethelred ordered an act of desperation and madness, the Street Bryce's Day Massacre. Convinced that the Danes, living peacefully in England, were spies for Sweyn, he decreed their extermination. Across southern towns, Norse settlers, men, women, children were slaughtered. Even Gunhilda, said to be Sweyn's sister, was killed. It was the first genocide in England's recorded history. The horror sent a shiver across the North Sea. Sweyn Forkbeard, hearing of his sister's death, swore a vengeance that would not end until England was his. In 1003, he came. Sweyn's fleets landed in Wessex, ravaging the countryside. His men burned Wilton, Sarum, Exeter names that had been safe for a century. They advanced inland, unopposed, until they reached the old heart of Alfred's kingdom. Ethelred fled from town to town, his armies slow to gather, his commanders divided by jealousy. The chronicles record his despair with cruel simplicity, and the king did nothing worth speaking of. For all his faults, Ethelred was not a coward. But he lacked the steel of Alfred and Edward, the unity that had once held England firm. When Sweyn withdrew after the campaign, it was not in defeat, but to prepare for the next blow. He had tasted the land, measured its defenses, and seen its weakness. By 1013, the inevitable came. The sea darkened with hundreds of Danish ships, Sweyn's full invasion force, carrying warriors from Denmark, Norway, and the Baltic lands. They struck like a tide against every English shore at once. One by one, the great cities fell. Oxford, Winchester, London. The earls surrendered or fled. The English people, exhausted by decades of taxation, invasion, and betrayal, began to see Sweyn not as an enemy, but as a ruler who could bring order. By Christmas, the Dane was proclaimed King of England. Ethelred fled to Normandy, where his wife, Emma, sister of the Norman Duke, awaited him. He had lost his father's land to the descendants of his father's enemies. But even now, the story was not finished. Sweyn Forkbeard ruled England for barely 5 weeks. In February 1014, he died suddenly, perhaps of illness, perhaps by divine judgment, as the monks wrote. His army, leaderless and restless, prepared to crown his son Canute. But the English nobles, desperate to avoid another generation of war, sent for Ethelred to return. For one brief, flickering moment, the old dynasty came back. Ethelred returned from exile, hailed as king by those who had once abandoned him. But the years of peace and faith that Alfred had built were long gone. England was broken, its towns blackened, its people impoverished. Canute fled, but not for long. He would come again with a vengeance that would outlast every Saxon king before him. And when he did, the age of Alfred's heirs would end forever. One sea, one crown, one god. The age of kings was about to begin. The winter of 1014 came with salt in the wind and omens in the sky. England bled from the wounds left by Sweyn Forkbeard's conquest, and now the Danes stood without a leader. Sweyn's death in his camp at Gainsborough sent ripples through every hall from London to Jutland. The throne that had been won with terror was suddenly empty, and the balance between Saxon and Viking trembled on the edge of collapse. Into that vacuum stepped his son Canute. He was young, barely 20, untested in rule but forged in the furnace of northern war. His hands had known oars before crowns, and the stories said he could read the sea as easily as a priest reads scripture. But when the old king's body was carried back to Denmark, his army in England began to waver. Some lords swore that England was lost without Sweyn's iron will. Others whispered that Canute would return to Denmark and vanish, like a shadow at dawn. Yet Canute did not flee. He stayed long enough to measure his enemies, and they were many. The exiled Ethelred, the so-called unready, returned from Normandy with his sons and mercenaries, reclaiming London and promising revenge. The English lords, weary of Danish tribute, turned once again to their native line. The tides of allegiance shifted like sand, and the young Viking prince was forced to withdraw across the North Sea. But retreat was not defeat. In Denmark, Canute gathered what his father never had: unity. He bound the Jarls to him with gold, marriages, and threats, forged alliances in Norway and Sweden, and filled his longships with a generation raised on the legends of Lindisfarne and Malden. When the sails unfurled again in 1015, the invasion that followed was not a raid but a reckoning. The fleet landed along the Severn, and England once more found itself split between memory and fear. Edmund Ironside, the son of Ethelred, stood defiant. He was everything. His father was not bold, relentless, carved from the same stubborn oak as Alfred before him. As Canute advanced from the south, Edmund fought him in the north, gathering men from the shires, lighting beacons across the hills. Through the years 1015 and 1016, England became a graveyard of kings. Ethelred died in April, broken and sick, leaving his son to face the storm alone. That summer, the war reached its fever pitch. Battles flared at Penselwood, Schurston, Brentford, none decisive, all savage. Canute's Danes fought like men possessed, their axes sweeping through mail and bone. Edmund's English met them blow for blow, their spears glinting with desperate fury. Then came Asandun. On an autumn morning in 1016, under a pale, cold sun, the two armies met for the last time. Chroniclers wrote that the earth shook with the noise steel clashing, shields splintering, banners falling. The air stank of iron and prayer. Canute placed his veterans in the center, men who had followed his father for decades. Edmund's forces, brave but weary, charged first. For hours the battle hung in balance. The Danes gave ground, then pushed back, singing the old hymns of Odin even as priests cried Latin blessings over the English dead. And then, at last, the Saxon line broke. Whether from exhaustion or betrayal none could say, the field of Asandun became red mud, and the crows feasted until sunset. When the fighting ended, both men still lived, and that was the true marvel. Edmund Ironside, his armor torn, met Canute beneath the trampled banners. Neither wished to see England burn to ash again. So they did what their fathers never could. They spoke of peace. England was to be divided, Edmund ruling Wessex, Canute the north. It was a fragile bargain, but for a brief moment, two warriors, enemies by birth and faith, shared the same dream that the land might know silence again. That winter, Edmund died suddenly, some said by wound, others by dagger. The truth was buried with him. Canute was left standing alone, the sole ruler of England. For the first time, a son of Denmark wore the English crown not as a conqueror, but as a king, accepted by the people he had once invaded. The Viking Age, born from raids and fire, now wore silk and gold. Canute moved his court to Winchester, kept English advisors, and married Emma of Normandy, Ethelred's widow, binding the old royal blood to his own. It was both a political act and a statement of destiny. The Norseman would rule not as a foreign tyrant, but as the heir of Alfred, the keeper of England's soul. Yet Canute's mind never stayed still. Across the North Sea, Denmark waited. Beyond that, Norway smoldered with rebellion. He saw not just a kingdom, but an empire, one crown for all the northern world. And so, while he knelt in English cathedrals, hearing Latin hymns and swearing Christian oaths, his dreams still smelled of salt and war. By 1018, Canute's fleet stretched across the horizon. Tribute from Scotland poured into his coffers. The Danegeld was replaced with taxes that built churches and harbors, proof that even a conqueror could govern. Monks wrote his name alongside Alfred's. Priests praised him as Rex Anglorum et Danorum, king of the English and the Danes. But within those walls of power, the memory of Asandun never died. The English still whispered of Edmund the Brave. The Danes still drank to Sweyn the Mighty. And Canute himself, in the quiet hours before dawn, would walk to the sea and watch the tide rise and fall. The waves obeyed no king, not even him, a lesson he never forgot. By the time his son was born, England was no longer the same island that had once burned under his sails. The Viking had become the law, and the cross had replaced the raven banner. Yet somewhere, deep beneath the carved stones of Winchester, the old gods still stirred in the silence, remembering the storm that had made them king. He united the sea but could not command time. By the year 1020, Canute the Great stood at the height of his power. The wars that had once devoured England were silent now. His banners flew above Winchester, York, and London. The shouts of "Hail Canute" echoed not only in English markets but across the fjords of Denmark. From the Shetlands to the Elbe, one man ruled the north not by plunder, but by order. He governed through strength and silence. The same hand that once wielded an axe now signed laws in Latin. He kept both English ealdormen and Danish jarls at his council, balancing ambition with fear. Taxes were regular, justice harsh, roads kept clear of bandits. To the church, he gave silver and protection. To warriors, he offered stability and land. For the first time since the Roman legions, the island knew peace under a foreign-born king. But peace was never enough for a man raised on the sea. Canut's mind turned again toward the horizon. In Denmark, rivals murmured. His brother Harold had died, leaving the Danish throne open to his claim, but rule across two kingdoms demanded more than armies. It required faith. Canute had long understood that power in the 11th century was not just written in blood, but in parchment and prayer. The church held as much sway as the sword. So he wrapped himself in piety. He rebuilt monasteries destroyed by raids of his forefathers, endowed abbeys at Ely and Berry Street, Edmonds, and declared himself a Christian king sent by God to redeem the sins of the Vikings. The irony was not lost on his subjects. The very faith once burned by the Northmen now blessed their heir. His marriage to Emma of Normandy, widow of Ethelred, mother of future kings, became the cornerstone of his legitimacy. She was elegant, calculating, and politically brilliant. Together they projected a new image: the christened conqueror and his queen. Coins bore their faces side by side, equal in grace and command. But in his heart, Canute remained a man of tides and storms. The next years brought the empire's zenith. In 1025, he marched east, facing the growing power of Olaf II of Norway. The two men, both baptized, both ambitious, claimed the same divine right. Their war was one of faith and sovereignty. Canute's fleets met Olaf's allies at the Battle of Helgio, a clash fought amid mist and river currents. When it ended, the north itself seemed to bend toward the Dane. Olaf fled into exile, and Norway, battered, divided, fell under Canute's rule. For a moment, the world saw what had never been seen before: a single monarch ruling the entire Northern Sea, England, Denmark, and Norway, the North Sea Empire. It was not held by walls or parchment, but by the will of one man. Merchants from the Baltic brought furs and amber to London docks. Priests from Rome traveled north to preach beneath wooden crosses, where pagan stones still stood. The Viking world had become a Christian empire, yet no empire stands without cracks. Beneath the crown, ambition whispered. Canute had sons from different wives: Harold Harefoot, born of a Danish consort, and Harthacnut, his son with Emma. Which bloodline would inherit the north? Which would rule England? His attempts to unite the future only sowed division. By 1027, he turned his gaze south to Rome itself. He traveled as a pilgrim, not a conqueror. Chroniclers wrote that when Canute entered the city, even the Pope greeted him with honor. He prayed at St. Peter's tomb, offering gold for forgiveness, and declared that from that day forward, English pilgrims would travel to Rome without paying tolls along the way. To his people, this was proof of divine favor. To Canute, it was something else, a quiet acknowledgement that power on earth was fleeting. When he returned home, his beard had gone gray, and the sea no longer called him as it once had. The empire was vast, but its weight pressed hard on his shoulders. He began dividing responsibilities between his sons and earls, delegating rule but keeping suspicion alive in every court. Enemies watched for weakness in Norway, in Sweden, and even in his own family. The last years of Canute's reign were filled with both grandeur and solitude. He built churches faster than ships, perhaps in search of redemption. He summoned bishops and monks, seeking prayers that might outlast his name. Some said he had grown humble. Others whispered that he feared the old god's revenge. The same king who had once mocked the sea by setting his throne on the shore now understood its lesson. Even the mightiest ruler must bow before something greater. That legend of Canute, commanding the tide to halt, was born in these years. Chroniclers later told it as a parable of humility, how the king ordered the waves to stop, only to watch them rise and soak his feet, proving that no mortal commands the sea. Whether he meant it as jest or confession, no one knew. But those who had seen him fight beneath storm clouds believed that, for a moment, he truly wished to test the limit of his power, to see where a king ends and the world begins. In 1035, the North Sea Empire reached its silent twilight. Canute died at Winchester, surrounded by priests and the murmurs of Latin prayers. He was no longer the boy who had crossed the waves with his father's ashes. He was a king who had ruled 3 nations. built cathedrals, and turned raiders into rulers. They buried him in the old minster, beneath carved stone and English hymns. When word of his death spread, the empire began to fracture almost instantly. The tides of allegiance rolled backward. Norway reclaimed its independence under Magnus the Good. Denmark descended into civil strife. And England, weary of foreign kings, prepared once more for the return of its native line. But even as borders dissolved, the memory of Canute endured. The old world had changed forever. The age of Viking conquest had ended not with a sword, but with a crown laid upon an altar. From that day, no sea would ever again belong entirely to one man. Yet the echoes of his empire still haunted every wave. The last of the sea kings had gone to rest. The world he forged now belonged to God, not the gods. When Canute the Great died in November of 1035, the North Sea fell silent for the first time in a generation. The man who had ruled England, Denmark, and Norway beneath one crown, who had made himself the master of two continents, was gone. No warrior, priest, or king had seemed so eternal, so certain to command the waves forever. Yet, like the tide he had conquered, his empire began to ebb the moment his heart stopped beating. The vast realm that had been forged through blood and brilliance now hung in the balance. England, once the jewel of his dominion, trembled in uncertainty. Across its fields and cold rivers, men waited to see who would wear the crown next. Canute's eldest son Harold, known as Harefoot for his speed and cunning, or Harthacnut, the younger son of Canute's queen, Emma of Normandy. One born of an English mistress, the other of royal Norman blood, both sons of the same Viking conqueror, but divided by their mother's ambitions and their own hunger for power. Harthacnut, the rightful heir in his mother's eyes, ruled in Denmark when his father died. But Denmark itself was under threat. Magnus of Norway, the son of Saint Olaf whom Canute had driven into exile, had returned with vengeance in his heart. Harthacnut could not abandon the kingdom his father had fought to keep. So the English throne, left vacant, became a battlefield of intrigue. In London, the nobles of England met in council. On one side stood Queen Emma, cold and immovable, holding her son's claim with all the pride of Normandy behind her. On the other stood Earl Godwin of Wessex, the most powerful man in England after the king, watching, weighing, waiting. For now, Godwin threw his support behind Harold Harefoot, perhaps seeing in him a ruler he could shape, or perhaps sensing the winds shifting against the absent Harthacnut. In the winter of 1036, Harold took the crown, though not yet the title of king. He ruled as regent first, then as monarch, in all but name. It was a usurpation born of necessity and cunning, a Viking's inheritance, not granted by birth, but by strength. Harold Harefoot ruled England as his father's ghost still haunted the halls of Winchester. But he lacked Canute's iron will and his broad vision. Where Canute had brought order through power, Harold brought fear through speed and suspicion. His reign was short, brutal, and uncertain, defined not by conquest but by paranoia. Emma of Normandy was banished from court, fleeing to the safety of her Norman kin across the Channel. With her went her younger son, Alfred, and her elder son, Edward, the children of her first husband, the long-dead English king Ethelred the Unready. For the first time in years, the sons of England's old royal line returned to the edges of power, their exile shadowed by vengeance. In the year 1036, Alfred set sail from Normandy with a small company of Norman soldiers. He came, perhaps to visit his mother, perhaps to reclaim what was lost. But he landed in a land no longer his own. Earl Godwin met him on the coast of Kent with false words and open arms. What followed was one of the blackest deeds of the age. Alfred's men were seized, their hands bound with rope and their eyes gouged out. The prince himself was taken north and blinded, dying soon after in agony. The story was whispered that Harold had ordered it, but it was Godwin's men who had done the work. In one moment, the bloodline of Old England seemed to end upon a dark road, and Harold Harefoot's throne was secure. Yet no crown built on treachery lasts long. The people, weary of murder and division, began to murmur the name of Harthacnut again. By 1039, Harold's health faltered. He died suddenly in Oxford, perhaps poisoned, perhaps consumed by his own restless spirit. His body was buried with honor in Westminster until his brother came. Harthacnut landed in England with a fleet of Danish ships and an army ready for vengeance. His rule began not with peace, but with desecration. The corpse of Harold was dragged from its grave, beheaded, and cast into the marshes of the Thames. The vengeance of sons was a familiar tale in the Viking world, and Harthacnut's justice was cold as the northern seas. For 2 brief years, he ruled both Denmark and England, the last king to unite the North Sea Empire. But the burden was too great. England groaned under heavy taxes to pay the wages of his Danish fleet. The ships drained the treasury and the people's patience. Across the countryside, old scars reopened. Peasants remembered the years before Canute, when England had been theirs. The dream of empire began to sour into resentment. In 1042, at a feast in Lambeth, Harthacnut raised a cup to celebrate a wedding and fell dead before he could drink. He was only in his mid-20s. Some said it was a stroke. Others whispered divine retribution. Either way, his death ended more than a reign. It ended the age of the Viking kings in England. The crown passed quietly, almost miraculously, to Edward, son of Ethelred and Emma. For the first time in a generation, an English-born monarch sat on the throne of England. They called him Edward the Confessor, though in these early years he was simply Edward of Wessex, a man marked by faith, caution, and a haunted calm. He had seen brothers die, kingdoms fall, and oaths betray. Edward owed his crown to Earl Godwin, the same man who had betrayed his brother years before. In politics, memory bends to necessity. Godwin, now old and heavy with power, ruled the south of England as his private realm. His sons Harold, Swine, and Tostig rose like wolves in the new court. Their ambition wrapped itself around the king's quiet piety, like ivy climbing stone. For a time, peace held. Edward strengthened the church, welcomed Norman advisors, and built alliances across the Channel. Yet his court was divided. The old English lords whispered that he favored foreigners. The Normans, sleek and shrewd, brought with them their customs, their Latin prayers, their vision of order. The seeds of a new kind of conquest were being sown not by sword, but by culture and counsel. Edward, who had spent half his life in exile in Normandy, trusted his Norman friends more than his English ones. But in Wessex, the house of Godwin watched and waited. The Viking Age had ended, but the struggle for England was far from over. By mid-century, the world that Canute had ruled was gone. The Norse kingdoms had fractured into petty wars. Magnus of Norway, who had once vowed to avenge Saint Olaf, was dead, his body cold on a Danish shore. Harald Hardrada, the hard ruler, now sat upon the Norwegian throne, dreaming of empire. His armies built fleets again, and his name carried the old fire of the north. Yet England had changed. Its fields were green again, its churches rebuilt, its people weary of northern kings. The Viking in them had quieted, replaced by farmers, traders, and craftsmen. But the memory of the dragon-proud ships still haunted the horizon. Edward's England stood at peace, but peace, in the medieval world, was only the stillness before the next storm. By the middle of the 11th century, England stood between two worlds. To the west, the memory of the Viking sea kings still lingered like the taste of salt on the wind. To the east, across the Channel, Normandy sharpened its ambition beneath the rule of a young duke named William, a man descended from Vikings himself. England's peace was fragile, and beneath the quiet hum of monasteries and markets, the pulse of rivalry beat harder every year. King Edward the Confessor ruled not with the sword, but with the cross. His reign was marked by piety, not power of virtue in a monk, but a danger in a king. He was mild, deliberate, and devoted to God, yet his kingdom was a chessboard crowded with restless men. The greatest of them all was Earl Godwin of Wessex. Godwin's might stretched from Kent to Devon, his wealth rivaling the crown's. His marriage to Githa, a Danish noblewoman, had bound the Saxon and Viking worlds together. Their sons, Harold, Tostig, Gurth, Leofwine, were raised in the shadow of both war and courtly ambition. Each bore the pride of warriors, but also the shrewd patience of statesmen. To rule England, Edward would have to tame the House of Godwin, and he could not. In 1045, Edward married Edith, Godwin's daughter, a match meant to bind loyalty to the throne. But the union was cold and political. The pious king sought no heirs, and the queen's influence became suspect in the eyes of Norman courtiers. Whisper by whisper, the seeds of suspicion grew. Normans filled the highest ranks of Edward's court bishops, counselors, even soldiers. They spoke French at council, Latin in the chapel, and looked across the sea to Normandy rather than north to York or west to Mercia. The English lords gritted their teeth, remembering the old Viking arrogance now reborn under another name. By 1051, the tension reached its breaking point. A violent quarrel in Dover between the townsfolk and the Norman retinue of Eustace of Boulogne, one of the king's foreign allies, left blood in the streets. Edward, furious, demanded that Earl Godwin punish his own people. Godwin refused. "I will not butcher Englishmen for foreign pride," he is said to have declared. That defiance broke the peace. The king, urged on by his Norman bishops, outlawed Godwin and his sons. The mighty House of Wessex fled across the sea, their estates seized, their influence shattered. For the first time in 20 years, Edward ruled England without them. But the calm that followed was hollow, for the exiled wolves were not gone, only waiting. In Flanders, Harold Godwinson gathered ships and swords. He had learned from his father not only how to fight, but how to listen. England's heart still beat in rhythm with the name Godwin. When the harvest came in the following year, Harold returned not as an outlaw, but as a liberator. His fleet sailed up the Thames, his banners fluttering in the cold wind, and the people rose to him. Edward's Norman allies, caught unprepared, fled the country. The king had no army strong enough to resist. Instead, he summoned his old rival to Westminster. There, in a moment that would echo through history, Harold and his brothers knelt before Edward. They swore loyalty anew, and Edward, ever the cautious man of faith, forgave them. The Godwins were restored to their lands, richer and stronger than before. The lesson was clear. In England, kings ruled by grace, but the great earls ruled by will. Time, however, was thinning. Earl Godwin died suddenly in 1053, collapsing at the king's table. Some said it was divine justice. Others called it the weight of his own ambition. His mantle passed to Harold, now the most powerful man in the realm. Harold was not his father. He was steady, diplomatic, and pragmatic, a leader shaped less by fire than by patience. Under his watch, England prospered. He strengthened defenses along the southern coast, repaired old fortresses, and negotiated with the Welsh and Scots. He was the protector of England in all but name, while Edward retreated deeper into his faith. Yet even as Harold built, his brother Tostig tore down. Appointed Earl of Northumbria, Tostig ruled with pride and cruelty. His taxes were heavy, his punishments swift. In 1065, the Thangs of Northumbria rose against him, driving him into exile. Harold, called to mediate, sided with the rebels. Blood was avoided, but a brother's bond was broken. Tostig, humiliated, swore vengeance not just on Harold, but on the England that had rejected him. The next year brought omens. Edward grew frail, his mind slipping toward the next world. In those same months, Harold crossed the sea to Normandy on a mission that would later twist into legend. Some said he was shipwrecked, others that he came seeking release for English prisoners. Whatever the truth, he fell into the hands of Duke William, the bastard son of Robert of Normandy. Now a towering figure of power, William welcomed Harold with smiles and honor, showing him the grandeur of his duchy. But the Duke's generosity was a snare. Before he left, Harold was compelled by oath, by fear, or by trickery to swear on holy relics that he would support William's claim to the English throne upon Edward's death. It was an oath sworn in a foreign land, but it would bind the fate of nations. When Harold returned home, he said nothing of it. He had no choice but to serve his king and his country. But across the Channel, William waited, patient and certain that the crown of England was promised to him. In January 1066, the old king's body finally gave out. Edward the Confessor died without an heir, his last days spent in prayer and silence. The Witan, England's council of nobles, met at once. They chose Harold, the man who had defended the realm, who had wealth, wisdom, and the loyalty of the people. He was crowned on the same day Edward was buried, as bells tolled across London. The age of the Vikings was long past, but England's crown still carried its storm within. Harold II, last of the Saxon kings, ruled a kingdom surrounded by enemies and haunted by oaths. To the north, Tostig found refuge in Norway with King Harald Hardrada, the fiercest warrior of his age. Hardrada had fought in the east, in the service of the Byzantine emperors, and returned home rich and battle-hardened. He claimed England not by right of blood, but by the strength of his sword and the legacy of Canute's empire. Together, Tostig and Hardrada made their pact. In the summer of 1066, their fleets set sail across the North Sea, longships gleaming under the endless sun, dragon-heads breaking the waves. England, unready for the twin storms, would soon face both north and south. In September, the Viking sails appeared at the mouth of the Humber. The invasion was swift and brutal. York fell. Its lords bent the knee. The old gods seemed to rise again, if only for a moment. But Harold, moving with astonishing speed, marched north with his army. At Stamford Bridge, under a clear blue sky, he met the invaders. The battle that followed was one of legend, a clash of the last Saxons and the last Vikings. The Norse fought with ferocity, their shield wall unbroken, until the English flanked them across the river. Harald Hardrada, towering and fearless, took an arrow through the throat. Tostig fell beside him. By evening, the field was silent, strewn with the dead of two worlds. The Viking Age ended there in blood, not ceremony. But even as Harold celebrated his victory, a messenger arrived from the south. Duke William had landed in Sussex. The Normans were here. And so, before the bodies of the last Vikings were even buried, England's king turned south to face the next invasion and the final chapter of the Old World. When the Old World fell, it did so beneath a gray sky. The year was 1066, and England had outlived a generation of kings and invaders. The blood of Alfred, Canute, and the countless sons of both Saxon and Dane ran through its soil. For a brief moment, the land was at peace. But that peace was only the silence between storms. When King Edward the Confessor died childless in January, the throne stood empty, and every crownless head in Europe turned toward it. England, rich and scarred from a century of conquest, had become the final prize in the struggle between the cross and the sword. Harold Godwinson was the first to act. Born to the mightiest noble in England, he had risen through loyalty, warfare, and cunning diplomacy. He had fought under Edward, led men against Wales, and commanded the fleets that kept England's coasts secure. When the dying king supposedly named him heir, the Witan, England's council of nobles and priests, raised Harold as king within days. The people cheered him, the first truly English monarch in half a century. Yet even as the cheers echoed through Westminster, the news had already crossed the sea. To the north, in the long halls of Norway, another man heard of Edward's death, Harald Hardrada, the last of the great Viking kings. He had fought in the east, served in Byzantium's Varangian Guard, and built an empire from the snows of Scandinavia to the steppes of Russia. Now, in his 50s, scarred but undefeated, he claimed England as the inheritance promised to his forebears by Canute the Great. He would sail once more, not for trade or raid, but to reclaim the Viking world's last dream, a united North Sea kingdom. And to the south, across the narrow channel, Duke William of Normandy sharpened his claim like a blade. He said that Edward, his distant cousin, had promised him the throne years before. He said that Harold himself had sworn a sacred oath to support him. Whether that oath was truth or invention mattered little. In the 11th century, words could become swords. William's ships began to gather in Norman ports, his men crossing themselves before they built the masts that would carry them toward destiny. By summer, the clouds had gathered over England. Harold Godwinson watched the seas, his army restless along the southern coast. He knew William was coming, but the winds betrayed him, holding the Norman fleet in France for months. And while he waited for a storm from the south, another came from the north. In September, Harold Hardrada's longships cut through the North Sea, black sails slicing across the horizon. With him came Tostig, Harold's own exiled brother, driven by vengeance more than ambition. They landed near York, burning towns as they advanced. The old Danelaw rose again to meet them, men of northern England, still half Viking by blood, uncertain whom to follow. At Fulford, the English earls Edwin and Morcar gathered their forces to block the invaders. The marshes steamed with morning mist as the two armies clashed. Hardrada's veterans, hardened by decades of war, broke the English line with shields and axes, cutting them down until the river itself ran red. York surrendered, and Hardrada, proud and ruthless, believed England would fall easily. But Harold Godwinson moved with a speed that stunned both ally and foe. In less than a week, he marched his army from London to York, nearly 200 miles of roads and rivers, fields and forests without losing a single man. His soldiers arrived exhausted, their armor streaked with sweat and mud, but ready to fight. On the morning of September 25th, the English approached the Viking camp near Stamford Bridge. Hardrada's men had left their armor behind, expecting only negotiations. The surprise was total. Harold's army struck like a thunderclap, smashing through the bridge's defenders and sweeping across the meadow. What followed was slaughter. Hardrada's banner, the land waster, flew high until the king himself fell, an arrow buried in his throat. Tostig died beside him, brother against brother, blood mingling on English soil. The Viking Age, which had begun with fire on the shores of Lindisfarne nearly 3 centuries earlier, ended there in smoke and silence. For a few days, England was saved. Harold had done what no king before him had managed. He had destroyed a Viking invasion with English hands alone. The people rejoiced. The threat from the north was gone. But as the bodies cooled at Stamford Bridge, new sails appeared in the south. William of Normandy had landed at Pevensey. Harold's triumph turned to dread. His army, already worn and bloodied, had to march again from York to London and then to the coast near Hastings. The distance was the same, but this time it was autumn, and the men were tired, their wounds barely healed. Still, Harold moved fast, gathering what levies and housecarls remained. He would not let a foreign duke steal his crown. By October, the two armies stood within sight of one another, on the rolling hills near Hastings. The Normans brought cavalry knights armored in steel, trained in the deadly rhythm of charge and retreat. The English brought courage, axes, and the stubbornness of free men defending their land. Between them lay the fate of England and the end of the world that had been born from the ashes of the Viking Age. The morning of October 14th dawned cold and gray. The English shield wall stretched across Senlac Hill, a living fortress of wood and iron. They sang hymns and war songs, the language of Wessex and Mercia rising above the wind. Below, William's forces assembled in 3 divisions, Norman, Breton, and Flemish priests blessing their banners as they raised the papal flag. For the first time in history, conquest came with the seal of God. When the first arrows flew, it was as if 2 centuries of war and faith collided in that moment. The Normans advanced uphill, their horses struggling against the slope. The English axes struck with terrible force, cutting men and mounts alike. The first charge failed. The second nearly broke the line. Then came the ruse. William's men feigned retreat, drawing parts of the English line downhill. When the shield wall opened, the Norman cavalry surged through, splitting it apart. The battle raged for hours. Harold stood at the center, surrounded by his housecarls, fighting like the soldier he had always been. But as the sun sank behind the hills, an arrow or perhaps a sword struck him down. His banner, the Dragon of Wessex, fell. By nightfall, the field was a wasteland of broken shields and dying prayers. The English were destroyed. William, bloodied but unyielding, had won. He ordered a chapel built where Harold fell, as if to consecrate both his victory and his sin. In that moment, England's soul changed forever. The line of Saxon kings ended, and with it, the last echo of the Viking world. A new order was born, one built not by raiders or rebels, but by conquerors who ruled with cross and crown alike. Would you like me to continue directly into Part 2, William's consolidation, the harrying of the North, and the final end of the Viking legacy? Next, the morning after Hastings was not a dawn of triumph but of reckoning. The air reeked of blood and sea salt. The cries of the dying swallowed by gulls circling above the corpses. England, beaten and broken, lay still. William of Normandy, Duke turned conqueror, stood upon that ruined hill and saw before him a kingdom to be taken not by right, but by fire. He marched slowly toward London, his army cautious yet relentless. Villages fell silent as his men approached. The locals, once loyal to Harold, hid in woods and marshes, clutching what little food they had left. The English nobles hesitated, some fled, others yielded. Edwin and Morcar, the northern earls, swore fealty out of necessity, but their hearts remained unbowed. The church, fearing an age of vengeance, blessed William's cause in exchange for mercy that would never come. At Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066, William knelt before the altar as the new King of England. The coronation was meant to be divine, yet it began in terror. When the crowd outside heard the Norman guards shouting in French, they thought rebellion had begun. Swords were drawn, flames lit, and the streets burned, while priests struggled to complete the sacred rite. The echo of that chaos followed William for the rest of his reign, a reminder that no crown in England would ever sit easily. In the south, the Norman yoke tightened swiftly. Castles rose like teeth from the earthstone, and timber fortresses manned by foreign soldiers who spoke a language the locals could not understand. Land was seized, records rewritten, and the old Anglo-Saxon nobility swept aside. In the Domesday of Conquest, every field and village became property of the king, his bishops, and his knight. For the first time in centuries, England belonged not to its people, but to the will of one man. But the North refused to kneel. Beyond the Humber, old loyalties smoldered. The spirit of the Danelaw, once ruled by Canute and his descendants, still whispered through the heaths and fens. These were lands that had known the rule of Vikings and kings alike, and they would not easily bow to a Norman duke crowned by foreign priests. In 1068, rebellion spread like wildfire. Edgar Atheling, the last blood heir of the old royal line, returned from exile to rally the North. The city of York rose in defiance. Norman garrisons were cut down in their keeps, their banners burned. The people fought not for victory, but for vengeance for Harold, for Canute, for the freedom they barely remembered. William's answer was not mercy. He marched north with a fury no storm could match. From Lincoln to Durham, his men tore through villages, slaughtered livestock, and salted the earth. Whole communities were erased, their names lost to ash. Chroniclers would later call it the harrying of the North, a campaign so merciless that corpses lay unburied for months, and famine followed for years. Even the monks who had once prayed for the soul of England recorded the horror with trembling ink. It was laid waste from sea to sea. More than 100,000 starved before winter's end. Children froze in the ruins of their homes. Priests buried the dead without names. The North, cradle of the last Viking spirit, was broken forever. By 1070, England was unrecognizable. The language of its rulers was French, its laws Latin. The old English nobles were gone. Those who survived lived as servants in the estates that once bore their names. Yet William's victory was not only built on fear. He understood power as something that must be recorded, measured, and remembered. His clerks began a vast accounting, the Domesday Book, a census of conquest, a ledger of every acre, ox, and soul that could be taxed or owned. It was not only a tool of rule, but a monument to control. The church, too, was reshaped. English bishops were replaced with Norman ones, their cathedrals rebuilt in towering Romanesque stone. Canterbury, Winchester, and York became monuments to both faith and dominion. The cross and the sword had become one. But beneath this new order, something older still stirred. The English tongue, though beaten, did not vanish. It blended with the conqueror's speech, creating something neither French nor Saxon, a hybrid language born of defeat and endurance. The very people who had been silenced began, in time, to sing again in a new voice that would one day echo across the world. For William, the victory was total yet hollow. The peace he carved into England was written in blood. His sons quarreled, his barons grew restless, and the ghosts of those he had burned haunted his sleep. Chroniclers later wrote that he dreamed of fire and ice, of endless winter over the northlands he had destroyed. He had won an empire, but lost his rest. When news came of rebellions in Normandy, he turned homeward, leaving England in the care of men as ruthless as himself. His power crossed the Channel, but his heart remained forever divided between the land he conquered and the one that birthed him. In the decades after Hastings, England would change again and again. The Viking bloodlines faded into legend. The old gods, the old kings, and the old laws vanished, buried beneath Norman stone. Yet their memory endured in the names of villages, in the ruins of monasteries, in the faces of the people who tilled the same earth as their ancestors. The world that had begun with Viking sails and Saxon kings ended beneath the shadow of castles and cathedrals. The age of the longship was over. The age of the crown had begun. But as monks copied texts in their cloisters and peasants plowed the frozen fields, the wind still carried whispers of the old world, the songs of Odin's children, the dreams of Canute's empire, and the distant echo of a time when England had been both pagan and free. The land that had once burned now lay in silence. From the Humber to the Tyne, smoke no longer rose from the earth, only mist. Fields that had been rich with wheat and barley became wastelands where wolves prowled. The north, once proud and fierce under the banners of Canute and the Earls of York, had become a graveyard of unmarked souls. Yet even in ruin, life clung stubbornly to the soil. By 1070, the first fragile signs of recovery began. Survivors returned to the ashes of their villages, digging shallow furrows where Norman riders had once trampled the fields. They rebuilt with what they could: stones from fallen churches, timbers from burned halls, the bones of their dead buried beneath their feet. The famine that followed William's devastation lasted years, and some said it was God's punishment for rebellion. Others whispered that the king himself was cursed for the blood he had spilled. Monks in York, Ely, and Durham began chronicling the horror in careful Latin, preserving the memory of what had been lost. Their ink told of fire and steel, of bodies left for the crows, of mothers who sold their children to survive. But they also wrote of stubborn faith of English priests who continued to preach in their native tongue even as Norman bishops ordered them to stop. In hidden chapels and forest clearings, the old hymns were sung, and the old prayers, half Christian, half heathen, lingered on. William the Conqueror ruled from Winchester and Westminster, his authority absolute yet uneasy. His castles dotted the land like scars, symbols of a victory that could never quite rest. In the south, his Norman barons grew rich and arrogant, but in the north they ruled from behind thick walls, forever fearing vengeance from the people they had starved. To secure his throne, William turned to the church. The Pope had blessed his conquest, and now the king repaid that divine favor by building on a scale no English ruler had dared before. Cathedrals rose across the land: York Minster, Durham, Canterbury, each one vast and austere, built by English hands for Norman masters. Stone replaced timber, Latin replaced English, and the cross itself became a symbol of foreign dominion. Yet the king's greatest monument was not of stone, but of parchment. In 1085, fearing invasion from Denmark and rebellion at home, William ordered the most ambitious survey in medieval Europe. His clerks rode across England, counting every acre, ox, and peasant. The Domesday Book, they called it the Day of Judgment. Nothing like it had ever been done. For the first time in history, a king knew the worth of his kingdom, down to the last plow. But the iron hand that had built the New England began to tremble. William aged into paranoia. He saw rebellion everywhere, in his barons, in his sons, even in the church he had fortified. His eldest, Robert Curthose, demanded his inheritance of Normandy. His younger sons, William Rufus and Henry, whispered and schemed at court. The dynasty he had carved from blood threatened to consume itself. In 1087, while leading a campaign in northern France, William's horse stumbled among the burning ruins of Mantes. The saddle crushed his belly, and his body swelled with rot before he reached Rouen. The conqueror who had brought fire to England died in agony, surrounded not by knights but by monks. Even in death, he found no peace. His bloated corpse burst during the funeral, filling the church with a stench that sent mourners fleeing. Chroniclers called it divine justice. The man who had burned a land was himself consumed by decay. William Rufus, his second son, seized the English crown before his father's body had cooled. Robert inherited Normandy, but not the loyalty of its knights. Henry, the youngest, waited patiently, buying land, learning from the mistakes of both. The empire William had forged, a kingdom tied by sea and blood to the continent, began to crack. Under William Rufus, England grew rich again, though the people called him a tyrant. He taxed the church and mocked the faith that had crowned his father. Yet his reign brought stability of a kind: fewer wars, safer roads, a cautious prosperity born of fear. Castles multiplied, towns revived, a new class of merchants and tradesmen emerged, neither Norman nor Saxon, but something in between. The English language itself began to change, absorbing the speech of its conquerors. From this fusion of tongues, Latin, French, and the old Anglo-Saxon, came the first seeds of modern English. In the north, where memory lasted longer than mercy, legends grew among the peasants. They told of a sleeping king, a warrior, who would one day rise to drive the Normans back into the sea. Some said it was Harold, fallen at Hastings. Others whispered the name of Canute, the sea king who had once ruled both England and Denmark. The stories spread in the long winters, sung in taverns and around hearths. They were not rebellion, but remembrance, the last voice of a vanished world. When William Rufus was struck dead by an arrow in the New Forest in 1100, no man wept. His younger brother Henry seized the crown, promising justice where there had been greed. He issued the Charter of Liberties, a fragile attempt to heal the wounds of conquest. Under him, English and Norman blood at last began to mix in law, in land, and in lineage. The grandchildren of conquerors married the children of the conquered. The long war between sword and plow began to fade into uneasy peace. But the North, forever scarred, never truly forgot. Travelers wrote that the soil around York still yielded blackened bones, that some valleys remained empty a generation after the harrying. The church rebuilt its monasteries there, and pilgrims walked to the shrines of northern saints Cuthbert, Oswald, Hilda, praying not for victory, but for forgiveness. In time, those who had lived through conquest grew old. Their sons no longer remembered the old gods or the old kings. To them, William the Conqueror was not a tyrant, but a legend, a distant figure from a world of giants and dragons. And yet, in the quiet corners of the countryside, the people still called their children by Saxon names, still told tales of warriors who had fought for freedom, and still watched the northern lights as if they were the ghostly sails of longships returning from a forgotten age. The Viking world had ended, not with fire and thunder, but with silence, a silence that stretched across the centuries, carried in the voices, the words, and the very soul of England itself. When Henry took the crown in 1100, England stood at the threshold of 2 centuries, the wild world of warriors fading, the ordered realm of kings beginning. His coronation came swiftly after the death of his brother William Rufus, that strange, red-haired monarch found dead among the trees of the New Forest, struck by a hunter's arrow that may have been accident or ambition. Henry seized the treasury at Winchester before the barons could react. Within days, he was crowned, declaring himself the restorer of peace and justice. Yet even this new king carried the blood of conquest in his veins. He ruled not as a conqueror, but as an engineer of power. The brutality that had burned the North gave way to bureaucracy, to parchment and seal, to laws written rather than enforced by sword. Under Henry, England began to resemble a single body again, its parts stitched together by royal courts, coinage, and the growing power of the church. The Normans called it order. The English called it survival. Henry's great innovation was not in battle but in governance. He codified justice in written charters, limiting the excesses of his barons while securing their loyalty through marriages and wealth. The Charter of Liberties promised to end the abuses that had stained William Rufus's reign. No unlawful taxes, no forced seizures of land, no tyranny against the church. Whether these promises were kept mattered less than the fact that they were made. For the first time, a king spoke not only as conqueror but as guarantor. Still, the ghosts of the old world lingered. In the north, the descendants of those starved and burned during the harrying lived on, hardened by centuries of loss. They remembered, even when the rest of England had forgotten. To them, the South was a foreign land of French lords and Latin clerks, its justice distant and cold. They prayed to saints whose names were half pagan still, buried charms in the furrows with their seeds, and told their children of Odin's ravens and the heroes who once defied kings. Henry sought to tame even this memory. He founded abbeys in the northern wilds, Durham, Rievaulx, fountains sending monks into the silence where longships had once sailed. They came with scripture and plow, carving sanctuaries from forests and marshes. Their bells rang where once only war cries had echoed. It was conquest of a quieter kind, a victory not through blood, but through faith. In his court at Westminster, Henry gathered clerks and scholars, men who recorded his reign not as legend but as record. Latin flowed through their quills, transforming oral memory into history. They called their king Lion of Justice, a ruler who subdued not only men but time itself. Yet his justice was sharp. Rebels found no mercy. Rivals vanished into dungeons or foreign exile. Henry's strength lay in patience, in the slow tightening of the crown's reach. Beyond England's shores, the Viking world that had once ruled seas and kingdoms crumbled into dust. Norway fractured into petty earldoms. Denmark turned inward, its kings more priest than pirate. The longships that had terrorized Christendom became merchant vessels, carrying furs and timber instead of warriors. The sagas, once tales of battle and blood, began to speak of saints and pilgrims. The old gods had not been slain, but forgotten, their altars overgrown, their names surviving only as curses on the lips of shepherds. And yet their spirit endured in strange ways. The same sea kings who had once raided monasteries were now canonized by the Church Olaf of Norway, now Saint Olaf, protector of sailors. The same runestones that had marked graves now bore crosses, their carved dragons curling around Latin prayers. The line between pagan and Christian blurred until none could tell where one ended and the other began. Henry's England mirrored that transformation. The old Anglo-Saxon shires became Norman counties, their names half English, half French. The villages rebuilt after conquest grew into towns, trading hubs connected by roads and rivers. The descendants of housecarls became freemen, craftsmen, and merchants. Some even served as knights, their bloodlines unknown, but their loyalty unquestioned. The hierarchy of conquest began to bend under its own weight. By the time Henry reached old age, the idea of the English had begun to mean something new, not the conquered nor the conquerors, but a single people bound by a shared fate. Their tongue, once split between Saxon and Norman, merged into a strange, living hybrid. The language that would one day write chronicles and poetry was being born in the markets and fields of a land once torn apart by invasion. In 1120, tragedy struck that changed the future of kings. Henry's only legitimate son, William the Atheling, drowned in the White Ship disaster off the coast of Normandy. The vessel, filled with nobles and courtiers, sank after striking a rock in the night. Nearly all aboard were lost. When the news reached the king, he locked himself in his chamber for days. Chroniclers wrote that he never smiled again. With his heir gone, the fragile peace between England and Normandy trembled once more. Henry ruled another 15 years, gray and cautious, until his death in 1135. He left behind a kingdom, unified in law but uncertain in blood. His daughter, Matilda, was named heir a queen in an age unready for one. The barons refused her, and the realm once again fell into chaos. The civil war that followed would be known as the Anarchy, a struggle that undid much of what Henry had built. Yet, even in those dark years, the people endured. Towns survived, trade continued, and the memory of the Old North grew dimmer still. The Viking and Saxon worlds were gone, buried beneath cathedrals and castles, but their shadow remained in every church bell and every name carved into the stones of England. When monks of the 12th century wrote of the past, they called it the age before the kingdom, a time of kings without crowns and wars without end. To them, William, Harold, Canute, and the Sea Kings were not men but omens, reminders that order was fragile and peace was always bought with blood. The ashes of the North, long cooled, became the soil from which the New England grew. What had begun as conquest ended as nationhood. The descendants of the raiders and the conquered alike now tilled the same earth, spoke the same tongue, and prayed to the same God. The age of the longships had faded into the age of the crown, and from that crown, a kingdom was born that would one day rule the seas once ruled by the Vikings themselves. When Henry I died in 1135, his kingdom once carved from war and blood fell into shadow again. The barons whispered, bishops chose sides, and every castle became a fortress against its neighbor. The crown that had tamed the Norman wolves now lay between two rivals. Matilda, the daughter Henry had sworn to make his heir, and Stephen of Blois, the nephew who seized the throne in her absence. They called it the Anarchy. For nearly 2 decades, England became a chessboard of sieges and shifting loyalties. Villages burned, abbeys looted, and fields left to rot under smoke. Chroniclers wrote that Christ and his saints slept, but amid the ruin, something remarkable stirred the endurance of a people who refused to vanish again into dust. For the first time, English peasants had something to lose. The towns that William and Henry had fostered, London, Winchester, York, had grown into living hearts of trade and craft. Merchants, masons, and smiths now held more power than swords alone. The world of iron was giving way to a world of parchment, where a seal could carry more weight than a spear. In monasteries across the realm, scribes bent over vellum by candlelight, recording not only kings and wars, but charters, deeds, and contracts. Power no longer rode only on horseback. It was written, copied, and stored. The pen became the new weapon of empire. In those same abbeys, the memory of the North still breathed. Monks at Durham preserved the bones of St. Cuthbert, relic of the old Anglo-Saxon faith. At York, the archbishops traced their line to the days when Vikings ruled the city as Jorvik. Pilgrims came to pray, not realizing that beneath their feet lay the bones of Norsemen and Saxons alike, sleeping side by side beneath the same earth. Far across the sea, the Scandinavian kingdoms that had once unleashed dragons upon Europe now looked southward not to raid, but to rule through trade and faith. The sons of Vikings became crusaders. In 1103, King Sigurd of Norway sailed not to plunder, but to the Holy Land itself, the first European king to lead a crusade. His fleet cut through the Mediterranean like a ghost from another age, its sails white with crosses instead of ravens. The North had found a new god to serve and a new purpose to prove. By mid-century, Scandinavia's kings built stone cathedrals over the ruins of pagan halls. In Sweden, Uppsala, once the site of sacrifices to Odin, rose again as a Christian stronghold. In Denmark, Roskilde's great church glimmered with gold. The faith that had once been forced upon them by sword was now their weapon of choice. The Viking world had not died. It had evolved. In England, Matilda's war dragged on. Castles changed hands like coins. Loyalties turned with the wind. But even chaos could not undo what the Norman order had built. Out of blood and betrayal emerged a new ruler, Henry II, Matilda's son, a king not of conquest, but of law. When he took the throne in 1154, England was exhausted. The fields lay scarred, the people wary of any man who called himself king. But Henry ruled with relentless precision, tireless, calculating, and furious in intellect. He reforged the realm his grandfather had built and gave it a spine of iron and parchment. Under his hand, the common law was born, justice that followed no man but the crown itself. Sheriffs patrolled shires, courts recorded verdicts, and a single system of order spread through the land. For the first time, even a peasant might know the law by name. It was a revolution hidden beneath robes and scrolls. No banners flew for it, yet it would outlast every battle of the age. Beyond England's shores, Henry's dominion stretched wider than any since the Vikings across Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. He married Eleanor of Aquitaine, the most powerful woman in Europe, whose spirit burned as fierce as his. Together they ruled an empire that reached from the Pyrenees to the Scottish border, not through terror, but through administration. Yet even kings could not escape the curse of legacy. Henry's sons Richard and John would tear apart what he built. But in his reign, the medieval world reached its height, the sword and the seal in perfect balance. The North and South fused into one civilization. The echoes of the Vikings still haunted the edges of his realm. In Ireland, Norse Gaelic lords held ports like Dublin and Waterford, their ships trading between England, Norway, and the Baltic. Henry would claim Ireland for his own in 1171, landing at Waterford under the papal banner. The descendants of raiders became subjects of a greater conqueror. And yet, under the weight of empire, something ancient whispered. The sagas still survived in Iceland, where poets wrote of Odin and Thor, not as gods, but as myths of a lost age. The Edda and the saga of the Volsung stories, once told beside hearths, were now written for monks and kings. The oral world of the Vikings became the written memory of Europe. As the 12th century waned, England grew quieter, richer, and older. The wooden castles of the conquerors turned to stone keeps. Cathedrals climbed toward heaven in arches of light. The same people who once hid from raiders now built the tallest towers in Christendom. They no longer remembered the taste of ashes from the harrying of the north, nor the thunder of longships on the horizon. But in the patterns of their language, the shapes of their faces, the stubborn pride in their hearts, the North endured. The age of the Vikings had ended. The age of kings had begun. The last kings of iron. By the end of the 12th century, the sons of Henry II had inherited a kingdom that spanned more than the old Viking sea routes. It was an empire born from marriage and murder, from parchment and pilgrimage, and now it turned its gaze toward heaven and war. Richard, called the Lionheart, was no builder of peace. He was forged for battle, restless in spirit, a king who saw his crown not as a weight but as a banner to be carried across continents. When he took the throne in 1189, England's gold poured into his crusade chest. Thousands of ships left her shores, bearing men who thought they fought for Christ but would die for kings. Richard never meant to rule England. He meant to fight for it from afar. While he marched across the burning sands of the Holy Land, his realm bled quietly at home. The castles of his ancestors crumbled, taxes rose like tides, and the people who once feared their rulers now began to measure them. For all his glory, Richard was a shadow king, his name more myth than memory to the peasants who plowed the earth he barely saw. When he was captured on his return by the Duke of Austria, England was forced to ransom her own sovereign, the price of pride and power. Monks preached mercy, peasants muttered curses, but the ransom was paid. For a moment, it seemed that even captivity could not tame a lion. Yet when he died in 1199, pierced by an arrow at Chalice, his empire began to fade. In his place came John, younger, weaker, and haunted by a brother's legend. They called him Lackland, for he inherited little but suspicion. Where Richard's sword had inspired fear, John's rule bred contempt. He quarreled with the church, taxed his barons into rebellion, and watched as France, the land that had once been his family's heart, slipped from his grasp like sand. By 1204, Normandy was lost. The dream that began with William the Conqueror, the union of England and France under one crown, ended in humiliation. The Channel, once a bridge of empire, became a wall again. The bloodline of Vikings and Normans was now trapped on the island they had once invaded. Yet in John's failures, something extraordinary was born. His cruelty, his greed, his paranoia all drew the realm to its breaking point. In 1215, at a meadow by the Thames called Runnymede, a circle of barons forced the king to his knees. What began as rebellion ended as revolution in ink. They made him sign a charter, Magna Carta. It was not yet democracy, nor freedom, but it was the first time in English history that the will of the king was bound by law. Every sentence was steeped in iron and memory. The parchment declared that no man, not even a monarch, was above justice. That taxation required consent. That imprisonment required cause. These ideas were written in Latin, sealed with wax, and sent across a realm that had once bowed only to fear. Few peasants heard of it. Few lords believed it would last. Yet in time, Magna Carta would outlive all who signed it. It became the foundation of rights, the whisper that would echo through centuries from English fields to American shores. The Viking axe had become a quill, the warship a courtroom. The age of conquest had transformed into the age of conscience. Beyond England, the world shifted with it. In the far north, Icelandic scribes preserved the sagas of their ancestors, tales of Odin, Sigurd, and Ragnar, not as faith, but as history. Norway and Denmark grew into kingdoms of law, their fleets now carrying traders, not raiders. The spirit that once burned in longships found a new vessel in exploration and enterprise. By the year 1200, Europe's coastlines glittered with stone cathedrals instead of strongholds, monasteries instead of mead halls. The sky that once echoed with the cry of ravens now rang with bells. But even amid the cloisters and castles, the blood of the North remained. It was in the endurance of the English farmer, the hunger of the merchant, the pride of the soldier. It lived on in every man who refused to kneel too long, in every woman who kept a hearth through famine and fear. The Viking Age had not died, it had become human. When King John died in 1216, his body was buried at Worcester Cathedral. The monks sang prayers over a corpse that few mourned. Yet outside, the wind off the Severn carried an older music, the murmur of generations who had survived kings, plagues, invasions, and fire. They were no longer Saxons, nor Danes, nor Normans. They were something new, the English. The centuries ahead would bring their own storms, crusades, reformations, empires, but the bones of this world were set in those first, brutal centuries after the North fell silent. And so, the dawn that rose beyond the sea was not one of peace, but of endurance. It was the light that follows every fire, the kind that does not burn, but builds. When the longships vanished and the kings turned to dust, the spirit of the North did not die. It crossed the sea, the centuries, and the human heart. From the ashes of raids and ruin came a people who wrote their own destiny in law, in stone, in faith. The Vikings came to conquer the world, but in the end, they remade it. Like, share, and subscribe to keep the stories of our past alive.